Okay, so one of the things that we talked about today was how to identify passivity in a sentence. So what you're going to want to look at is the verb and whether or not the subject of the verb or of the subject of the sentence is the agent of the verb. So in the first example, Darwin studied, we have studied, and we have the subject Darwin, who is also the agent. He studied, right? And then we have the fauna of the Galapagos Islands was studied. The verb is studied. The subject is the fauna of the Galapagos Islands, but it's not the agent of the studying. The Galapagos Islands did not do the studying. Darwin did. So this is passive. That's how you identify it. So once you've identified that a sentence is passive, the only thing that you need to do as far as diagramming is to add the passive marker to the auxiliary. As you see here, it says passive or pass for passive. Other than that, it's your typical diagramming. So Paul McCartney was knighted. And so was knighted is, I guess, what's marked as passive. Was is the past tense of be. So, and then you have the en marker. It's similar looking to me. It's similar to the perfect aspect, right? It looks a lot like the perfect aspect. You can see here we have like a new sort of rule for auxiliary where it's added on top of the tense or modal or imperative. You have, you can either have these or a phrasal modal, perfect, progressive aspect, and passive voice. So that means, from what I'm looking at here, that you can have something that has a phrasal motive. It can be perfect and progressive. It can also be passive. It can be all of those things at one time. I can also either have a tense or a modal. And she just said that these are some of the ways that passive has a relationship. These are just some examples of the way that the passive voice can have a relationship with tense and aspect. So we have passive with modals. Diamonds can be mined. And then simple present, diamonds are mined. And then there's the alternative of get being used as passive. You can say, was Bruno arrested? Or you could say, did Bruno get arrested? And you see that these are passive because it doesn't say like, did the police arrest Bruno? In this case, arrested doesn't have an apparent agent in the sentence. It's vague in that sense. Like, and also he wasn't caught. It doesn't say who caught or who failed to catch. Again, we just assume the police of some sort, right? The alternative to saying he wasn't caught, no, he didn't even get caught. And get is noteworthy because it works better with perfect progressives. So you can see here his plans have been getting sidetracked for years. You could say his plans have been being sidetracked, but it doesn't go well. Like, it doesn't sound right to us. Oh, and don't think just because you see get that means that it's an alternative passive marker. Because like in this sentence, it's an active verb. Lou got sick. And in this case, sick is an adjective. She mentioned that passive is only present can only, a sentence can only be made passive when it has transitive verbs. And in fact, some passive sentences cannot be said in an active way that makes sense, right? Or, that sounds right, such as being born. We would say that so-and-so was born, somewhere. We wouldn't say that their mother bore them in a place. She also went over some, semantic constraints on using passive. So the more definite the subject is, the more acceptable the sentence is in passive form. So we don't want to say poems were written. If you're specific, though, you could say this poem was written by. In this type, if we're talking about multiple poems or general poems, like just multiple general poems, not even a group of poems, just poems in general, right? We would want to say Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote poems. It's more grammatically acceptable. With other verbs, the passive form is more acceptable the more indefinite the object is. So me is pretty specific, right? It's one person, it's me. And it doesn't sound right to use this in a passive way. Arthur Ashe was liked by me. It would be I liked Arthur Ashe. But it's okay to say Arthur Ashe was liked by everybody. Or by most, right? So the more vague it is, the more acceptable it is in the passive voice. These are some other verbs that are not acceptable at all as a passive. Verbs of containing, measure, reciprocal. So Lori is resembled by her father. It's resembled by is like resembles is reciprocal. They each resemble one another. So it doesn't really work as passive. Verbs of fitting. He is suited by the plan. That just sounds terrible. The plan suited him, I guess. A car is had by him. That's terrible, right? You would say he had the car. So verbs of possession shouldn't be passive. This one was tricky for me. Identifying whether something is active or passive, an adjective or passive. I thought the windows were broken. I thought that this was passive, right? And no, it's because there's nothing else as the sentence ends here. This is just a way of describing the window's state. It's a state of being. And then so it's an adjective here. So in this sentence, for example, the house was a mess, the paintwork was peeling, and the windows were broken. It's a participle that's used as an adjective. Now, in this sentence, the windows were broken by the force of the explosion. You have an object, an actor at the end, an agent, I guess you would say. The force of the explosion broke the windows. And so now broken is functioning as a passive participle. I think I remember her saying you want to mainly look for the agent there. Again, the beans were refried. Is in this state, it's just a state of the beans. They are refried. If it said they were refried by a person, then it's passive. But as is, it's the present state of the beans, and it's an adjective. This is interesting too. There is a middle voice. So you have active, passive, and middle voice. Active, you have the agent as the subject. Her high C shattered. What shattered it? The high C, right? The glass was shattered by her high C. What shattered it wasn't the glass was shattered. The high C shattered it. That's passive. But if we just say the glass shattered, That's middle voice. And here are some verbs that can be used as a middle voice. The cake is baking. We don't know who is baking the cake. We just know that it's baking. So that's a middle voice. The top spun. That's middle voice. The car drives well. That is middle voice. The window broke. Notice here it's a verb. It's not broken. If it said the window is broken, then it's, well, it's definitely, it's an adjective. I was thinking though that the window is broken would be a subject complement, but I don't know. Can something be a subject complement and also an adjective? These are some situations where a passive will be used. If the agent is not mentioned for these reasons. If the agent, mentioning the agent would be redundant or easy to supply. If the agent's unknown, if it's very general, if the speaker or writer is being tactful. So if Margaret was given some bad advice, we don't want to say who gave the bad advice. Or if the speaker's being evasive, an error was made in the budget, then maybe you might think like, oh, that person made that error. So we also went over sentences with indirect objects. Of course, you can't have a sentence with an indirect object if there's no object. We went over some typical verbs that are ditransitive, which means that they have an object and an indirect object. So gave is a ditransitive verb because you give something to someone or you hand something to someone. And so when you're working with a ditransitive verb such as sent, all of that stuff is going to go as part of the verb phrase. So John sent me a letter. Me and a letter is going to be part, both of those are going to be part of the verb phrase. Me and a letter. They're two different noun phrases, right? We got me and we got a letter. And they are both part of this verb phrase because send is inextricably tied to both me and a letter because they are the direct object and indirect object of that for that verb. And that verb is ditransitive when we mark that it is ditransitive and must have these by making them all part of the verb phrase. Now, sometimes it can get tricky, right? So Mary revealed the truth to Ken. Is Ken an indirect object of revealed, right? What was revealed? The truth. To who? Right? To whom, sorry. To Ken. Well, no. She said the way to test this, because I was so confused. I'm like, but it is the indirect object. It is, but it's optional, okay? She said test it by saying Mary revealed Ken the truth. Does it make sense to say it that way? And I'm like, no, it doesn't sound right. Then we know that it's not, we know that reveal is not a ditransitive verb. It doesn't have to be. It is not innately a ditransitive verb. It is being used as a ditransitive verb in this sentence, but we can just say Mary revealed the truth, and that's fine. There's no indirect object that is inherently implied for revealed. I hope that makes sense. It took me a minute to kind of digest that. So because to kin is not necessary, it is not inextricably tied to revealed. It's not necessary. It's added information. It's an adverbial. Okay? Now, this is what indirect objects will look like in the passive voice when you diagram them. So instead of Alice gave John the book, we have the book was given to John by Alice. By Alice is not necessary here. The book was given to John is the only thing that's necessary. So when we're looking at this verb give, the two things that are linked to it are the book and John, right? Somebody gave what? The book to who? John. These are going to be the ones that are tied to give. But because the book is the subject, it goes up here. And we mark it as passive. Was given is marked here as passive under the auxiliary. Give is the main verb. It is the be and the en that's part of the passive. Okay? But we are also marking the tense as past. That's why we have be under passive, because it's different than the tense, right? It's a whole separate thing. Now, to John is part of the verb phrase because it is the indirect object of give. So it's part of the verb phrase. By Alice, if this were an active sentence, Alice would be the subject. She is not linked to the verb phrase in the same way that the book would be had this been written in an active voice, okay? So she by Alice is part of an adverbial. It's a prepositional phrase that is marked as an adverbial in this sentence. I really hope that makes sense. Let me know if you have any other questions.